With the sound of rain hitting his roof, Jack contemplates Amélie's portrait with empty eyes. 3 years of silence since the storm took her away, leaving only empty hands and memories that hurt like open wounds. But fate weaves invisible threads. One morning, among the golden fog of the desert, small knuckles knock on his door. "I'm lost," says a voice that, unknowingly, brings with it the echo of an interrupted love and the promise of a dawn that seemed impossible. 2 broken souls, a forgotten medallion, and the courage to begin again. If this story of loss and rebirth has touched some fiber of your heart, gift us that pulse in the like button. Each heart that beats with ours illuminates this shared path. And now, tell us, how do you think this story between Jack and Clara will end? Will love be able to build a bridge over the turbulent waters of the past? Your voice is part of our journey. The Arizona sun punished the earth with an untamed fury, turning dust into gold and shadows into coveted refuges. Clara Beauchamp contemplated the undulating horizon, while her small fingers clutched the only possession she had managed to keep, a folded piece of paper with coordinates scribbled by a trembling hand. 12 years of life had taught her that tears were a luxury she could not afford, especially under that implacable sky that seemed to observe her with celestial indifference. In the distance, like an island in a sea of sand and cacti, a weathered wooden cabin rose among yellowish hills. The wind whistled through worn boards, creating a melancholic melody that resonated with the emptiness Clara felt inside. Her steps, hesitant at first, gained determination as she approached. The dust adhered to her worn cotton dress, tinting what was once white with ochre. She breathed deeply, feeling how the dry air burned her lungs. What would she say to the man who lived there? Would he believe her? Would he turn her away like everyone else? Her knuckles knocked on the IC wood with an urgency that contradicted her impassive face, educated not to show vulnerability. When the door opened, Clara held her breath. Before her stood Jack McAllister, a man carved by time and pain, with grey eyes that seemed like 2 deep wells where all hope had drowned. The unkempt beard framed lips that had forgotten how to smile. "I'm lost," she said, with a voice so clear and serene that it contrasted with her fragile appearance. In the silence that followed, Clara could hear the beating of her own heart, a frantic drum that marked the rhythm of her fear. It wasn't just a phrase, it was the deepest truth of her existence. Jack looked at her with distrust. His right hand tensed on the doorframe, as if he were considering closing it. But something about that girl with eyes too old for her age stopped him. Perhaps it was the merciless sun punishing her neck, or perhaps a fleeting memory of another person who was also lost once. "Come in," he finally murmured, moving away. From the threshold, "But don't stay long." Clara entered the dimness of the cabin, where time seemed to have stopped. The air smelled of rancid coffee and accumulated loneliness. On the wall, a framed portrait captured the radiant smile of a copper-haired woman. Clara noticed how Jack's gaze deliberately avoided that picture, like someone who skirts an abyss. That night, lying on an improvised cot, Clara heard the creaking of wood and Jack's incomprehensible murmurs in the adjacent room. Clinging to her only treasure, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, the girl contemplated the moon through a curtainless window. She was exactly where she should be, although she herself did not yet understand why. The days slid slowly like drops of honey on the invisible calendar that both had begun to share. Clara moved through the cabin like an educated shadow, occupying the least possible space, learning to interpret each gesture, each silence of that taciturn man who had taken her in. Jack, for his part, maintained a calculated distance, as if he feared that any approach could break something inside himself. The mornings followed an unspoken ritual. Jack would rise at dawn, prepare coffee so thick a spoon could stand in it, and go out to check the fences and feed the 3 horses that grazed in the adjacent corral. Clara would wait to hear the door creak before venturing out of her improvised bedroom. She would eat the leftovers he left, a hard bread, sometimes an egg, always in solitude. During the 3rd morning, while cleaning the dishes meticulously, Clara observed through the window how Jack worked under the sun. His precise movements revealed years of routine, but also an almost reverential care for each task. The way he caressed the backs of the horses, whispering words that the wind carried away, awakened in her a curiosity that began to crack her own reserve. That day, without a word being exchanged, Clara left a glass of fresh water next to Jack's tools. A silent offering, a first bridge extended over the abyss that separated them. He drank it without thanks, but the next morning, Clara found a bright red, perfectly polished apple on the table. The walls of the cabin were bare, except for that portrait. In her cautious explorations, Clara discovered small vestiges of a previous life: a brush with copper hairs between its bristles, a book of French poetry with marked pages, a handkerchief embroidered with the initials AM. In each object persisted the ghost of Amélie, whose name Clara had heard one night, murmured among agitated dreams. In the afternoons, when the heat subsided, Clara would sit on the porch, drawing with a piece of charcoal on yellowed papers she had found. She traced with surprising precision the contours of distant mountains, the silhouettes of horses, and sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, the severe profile of Jack bent over his tasks. A week after her arrival, while Jack repaired a saddle, he asked, without raising his gaze, "Where do you really come from?" Clara let the silence extend, as if seeking the answer in the infinite horizon. "From a place where I wasn't welcome," she finally responded, with a voice so controlled it seemed to belong to someone much older. Jack nodded without insisting. He, better than anyone, understood secrets that are kept like wounds that should not be touched. That night, for the first time, they dined together at the same table, surrounded by a silence that, little by little, began to feel less like a wall and more like a shared space. The desperate whinny tore through the stillness of dawn. Clara awoke with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window she saw Jack running toward the stable, a dark silhouette cut against the sky that was just beginning to turn pink. Without thinking, she put on her shoes and went after him. The cool morning air hit her face, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of wet earth and something else: fear. Entering the stable, she found Jack kneeling beside Shadow, the black stallion that seemed to be his favorite. The animal lay on the straw, with glassy eyes and its body shaken by violent tremors. "What's wrong with him?" Clara asked, keeping a prudent distance. Jack didn't respond immediately. His hands ran over the animal's body with the delicacy of one touching a valuable instrument. "I don't know," he finally murmured. "Last night he was fine." Clara approached slowly, observing how the horse's belly swelled abnormally. A memory emerged from the depths of her memory: the aroma of dried herbs, the deep voice of an older woman, wrinkled hands that taught her to distinguish remedies. I think he ate something he shouldn't have," she said, kneeling on the other side of the animal. "My grandmother knew how to treat this." Jack looked up, distrust drawn in every line of his face. Clara held his gaze, and for an instant, something passed between them. An invisible current, a mutual evaluation. "What do you propose?" he asked, each word loaded with suspicion. "I need some herbs, white willow if you have it, and hot water with salt." Jack's expression fluctuated between disbelief and desperation. Finally, he nodded and went to find what she asked for. Clara stayed with the horse, caressing its neck, whispering calming words in a language that was not her own. When Jack returned, he observed her mixing the herbs in the water, her small hands moving with a certainty that contradicted her age. Clara worked in silence, concentrated, as if the world had been reduced to that stable, that suffering animal, the task at hand. "My grandmother used to say that horses are like mirrors," she commented as she applied the poultice. "They reflect what we carry inside." Jack looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and surprise. It was the first time she had voluntarily mentioned something personal. They spent the entire morning with Shadow, taking turns to monitor his breathing. Clara took advantage of every moment to examine the collection of dried herbs that Jack kept in a wooden chest, inherited perhaps from better times. There was mint, rosemary, lavender, plants that spoke of care and knowledge that someone had treasured. By midday, Shadow managed to stand on trembling legs. Jack observed the animal with barely contained relief, and then, without warning, his eyes met Clara's. In them shone something the girl had not seen before: gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, with a voice hoarse from the disuse of kind words. Clara felt a warmth expanding in her chest, a feeling so strange it almost hurt. She didn't respond, but her lips curved slightly in what could be interpreted as a smile. That afternoon, Jack served 2 cups of mint tea on the porch. They sat side by side, contemplating the horizon in a silence different from the previous ones. The wind carried with it the aroma of freshly cut herbs, mixed with the unmistakable smell of earth and freedom that characterized that forgotten corner of the world. Dry Creek appeared before her eyes like a mirage, a handful of wood and stone buildings that clung to existence in the middle of the desert. Clara watched through the window of the dilapidated truck, while her hands nervously played with the hem of her dress, the only decent one she owned, meticulously ironed the night before. Jack drove in silence, his knuckles white from the pressure on the steering wheel. For him, this trip represented much more than a simple visit to town. It was breaking the self-imposed isolation he had maintained for 3 years. Clara knew it, although he hadn't verbalized it. She read it in the rigidity of his shoulders, in the way his gaze avoided any reflection in the rearview mirror. "We don't have to stay long," she said, surprising herself by taking the initiative to break the silence. Jack looked at her briefly, with an indecipherable expression. "Only as necessary," he responded, returning his attention to the dusty road. Upon entering the main street, Clara felt the weight of gazes even before seeing them. Provincial curiosity materialized in faces that peered through windows, in conversations that were abruptly interrupted, in steps that stopped to observe the truck that everyone recognized, but no one expected to see. They stopped in front of a modest building with a sign that read, "Dr. Esther Callahan, General Medicine." Jack had insisted that Clara needed a medical checkup, especially after finding her with a fever 2 nights ago. She had protested weakly, more out of habit than true opposition. The idea of being examined by a doctor awakened uncomfortable memories in her, but also a curiosity she couldn't deny. Dr. Callahan turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with a mane of grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and kind eyes that contrasted with her serious expression. She received them with barely disguised surprise. "Jack McAllister, I thought that mountains would have crumbled before seeing you cross that door again," she said, with a familiarity that spoke of shared years. Then her gaze settled on Clara, evaluating her with professional interest, but also something more, a spark of recognition that the girl didn't understand. During the examination, Clara remained silent, responding only as necessary. The doctor noticed the small scars on her hands, the marks of work improper for someone her age, but didn't ask questions about it. Instead, she commented on her excellent posture and her way of speaking, characteristics that betrayed a formal education. "She's somewhat malnourished, but otherwise she's a healthy girl," she finally informed Jack, who was waiting in a corner of the office. "Although I'd like to do some more tests next time." Then, when Clara dressed and went out to explore the waiting room, the doctor invited Jack for tea in her small back kitchen. Clara, pretending to examine an illustrated book on anatomy, strained her ear to catch fragments of their conversation. "She looks so much like her, Jack, especially in the eyes. It's none of my business, Esther. Amélie and I dreamed of opening a home for children without family. What are you insinuating?" She always talked about adoption. The name made Clara tense. Amélie, the woman in the portrait, the missing wife, an invisible link that perhaps explained why, of all possible places, her steps had guided her to that isolated cabin. Upon leaving the consultation, the entire town seemed to have casually congregated on the main street. Curious faces, some hostile, others simply surprised, followed their every movement. Jack walked with his head high, but Clara could feel the tension emanating from him. In front of the general store, a corpulent man in an impeccable suit and false smile cut off their path. Clara noticed how Jack tensed even more. "McAllister, what a surprise to see you among the living," said the man, extending a hand that Jack deliberately ignored, and with company, no less. "Vernon," Jack responded dryly. "We just came for supplies." Vernon Hale, the name came to Clara like a whisper in the breeze, the owner of half the town, according to what she had heard Jack mutter days before. His small, calculating eyes settled on her, evaluating her as one who appraises merchandise. "And who is this young lady?" he asked, leaning slightly toward Clara, who instinctively took a step back. "Her name is Clara," Jack responded, subtly positioning himself between her and Vernon, "and we're in a hurry." During the rest of the visit, Clara felt that the entire town breathed a secret she didn't know. Gazes followed her, some compassionate, others wary. At the school where Jack took her to talk about her possible enrollment, Miss Jenkins examined her with particular interest, asking questions about her previous studies that Clara answered with studied evasiveness. Back in the truck, returning to the cabin, Clara dared to ask, why was everyone looking at us like that? Jack remained silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. It's not at us, he finally said. It's at the ghosts they see when they look at us. Clara nodded, understanding at a level that went beyond words. Both carried ghosts, some their own, others borrowed. And in that town, those spectres seemed to take on an uncomfortable and tangible life. That night, lying on her cot, Clara took from her hiding place the small bundle wrapped in cloth, an ancient leather-bound diary with yellowed pages and an elegant handwriting that related the life of a woman who had intensely loved this same desert, these same mountains, this same taciturn man. A diary signed with a simple initial, A. The afternoon light filtered obliquely through the worn curtains, drawing golden patterns on the wooden floor. Clara passed the cloth over the furniture with methodical movements, occasionally stopping to examine framed photographs or small objects that spoke of a life abruptly interrupted. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and the cabin, previously immersed in a disorder born of abandonment, was beginning to breathe again. Her fingers stopped on a small carved wooden box. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, aware of crossing an invisible boundary. Inside, letters tied with a faded ribbon, a lock of copper hair, and a folded brochure. St. Clair Children's Home, a refuge for those seeking family. It was her dream. Jack's voice startled her. She hadn't heard him enter. She turned, with her cheeks flushed with the embarrassment of having been caught rummaging through someone else's memories. I'm sorry, Jack approached slowly, like one approaching a frightened animal. He took the brochure from her hands and contemplated it with a mixture of pain and nostalgia. Amélie always wanted to fill this house with children's laughter, he said, with a voice so soft that Clara had to strain to hear him. We could never have children of our own. It was the first time Jack had voluntarily spoken about his wife. Clara remained motionless, fearing that any movement might break the spell of this moment of shared vulnerability. What happened to her? She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack closed the box delicately, as if inside were not just objects, but also a time he did not wish to disturb. She disappeared during a storm 3 years ago. They say the current of the swollen stream dragged her away. They never found her body. Clara felt a knot in her throat. The pain in Jack's voice was so tangible, it seemed to fill the room, making the air denser, more difficult to breathe. I'm very sorry for your loss, she said, using the formal words she had been taught for occasions like this, although never before had they felt so sincere. Jack looked at her then, really looked at her, as if for the first time he saw her completely. His eyes, habitually opaque with contained pain, seemed to momentarily clear. You have the same gestures as her, you know? The way you tilt your head when you think, how you fold the corners of pages instead of using bookmarks. Clara lowered her gaze, feeling a strange weight on her shoulders. Was that what he saw when he looked at her? An echo, a reflection, a ghost of the lost woman. I don't intend to replace anyone, she murmured, the words coming out before she could contain them. Jack seemed surprised, as if the idea had never crossed his mind. He slowly shook his head. It's not that, he searched for words. It's as if she had sent you. That night, while Jack slept, Clara opened the secret diary again. The pages crackled under her fingers as she looked for the entry she had been avoiding since she discovered the book. May 12th. I have begun to investigate the Duval family. The rumors about their illegitimate daughter might be true. A girl born of a forbidden love, kept in the shadows. If I manage to find her, perhaps we can offer her the home she deserves. Jack says I'm obsessed, but he doesn't understand. Some souls are destined to meet. I feel that this girl, wherever she is already part of our family. Clara closed the diary, feeling that the air was failing her. The pieces were beginning to fit together in a way that caused her both fear and hope. It was not a coincidence. It had never been. The past and present intertwined like threads of the same fabric, a design that she was just beginning to discern. Amélie had been looking for her, and somehow, even from beyond this world, she had found her. Try again, said Miss Jenkins, handing her a new sheet of paper. But this time, draw what you feel, not just what you see. Clara observed the blank paper, intimidated by its immaculate vastness. Around her, other children drew with childish abandon. Houses with smoking chimneys, stick-figure families holding hands, smiling suns in corners of paper. Her hand, however, remained suspended over the sheet, undecided. A month had passed since her first day at the Dry Creek School, a one-room building where children of different ages shared lessons under the tutelage of Miss Jenkins. A young woman of fragile appearance but iron will, Clara, initially wary, had discovered in her an unexpected ally. She closed her eyes, letting sensations flow. Her hand began to move almost of its own volition. Soft strokes at first, then more decided. She wasn't drawing the still life that the teacher had arranged on the central table, a vase with wildflowers, but something much more intimate. When she finally opened her eyes, she was surprised by her own creation. She had drawn the interior of the cabin, but not as it was now, but as it could be. New curtains on the windows, fresh flowers on the table, books arranged on shelves that did not yet exist, and in the foreground, from behind, the unmistakable silhouette of Jack, contemplating the horizon from the porch with a less tense, less broken posture. "It's extraordinary," murmured Miss Jenkins, who had approached silently. "You have a gift, Clara." The girl didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the drawing, on that possible future that her subconscious had captured without her permission, a future in which the cabin was no longer a mausoleum of memories, but a home, her home. "I'd like to keep it for the festival exhibition," continued the teacher, "if you agree." Clara nodded distractedly. The Harvest Festival, an annual celebration that gathered the whole town, was rapidly approaching. Jack had mentioned they wouldn't attend. With the same naturalness with which he declined any invitation to social events, Clara hadn't protested, already accustomed to their shared seclusion. Upon leaving school, Vernon Hale was waiting for her, leaning on his shiny automobile, an absurd contrast with the dusty vehicles of the rest of the town. Clara tensed instinctively. During the last few weeks, the man had shown an insistent interest in her, always with the excuse of watching over the welfare of the community. "Miss Beauchamp," he greeted her, with that smile that never reached his eyes. "Allow me to take you home." "It's not necessary, Mr. Hale," Clara responded, clutching her notebook. "I prefer to walk." "I insist," he said, opening the car door. "Besides, I have a proposal to make to you." Something in his tone made Clara obey, although every instinct screamed at her to flee. She sat rigidly in the leather seat, maintaining the greatest possible distance. "Miss Jenkins has shown me some of your drawings," Vernon began, as the car advanced down the main street. "You have exceptional talent for someone your age." Clara remained silent, observing the landscape through the window. "I would like to sponsor your studies," he continued, unperturbed by her lack of response. "A proper education in an art school in Phoenix. It would be a shame to waste such talent in this forgotten town." "It's very generous," Clara responded, carefully choosing her words, "but I cannot accept." Vernon let out a little laugh that raised the hair on Clara's skin. "I haven't mentioned the conditions, dear," he said, slowing down the vehicle. "My generosity naturally would require certain reciprocity." Clara looked at him then, defiant, despite the fear she felt growing inside her. "What kind of reciprocity?" "McAllister's lands," he responded, all pretense of kindness evaporated. "They border my property and contain an aquifer I need. Convince him to sell me those lands and your future will be secured." Indignation lit Clara's cheeks. The car stopped by the road that led to the cabin, now visible in the distance. "Those lands are not for sale," she said, with a firmness that surprised even Vernon. "Not for gold, nor for promises." She exited the vehicle before he could respond, closing the door with more force than necessary. As she walked toward the cabin, she felt Vernon's gaze drilling into her back, but she didn't turn around. Something had changed within her. She was no longer just a fugitive seeking refuge. Now she had something to protect. That night, while preparing dinner, Clara noticed that Jack was looking with interest at one of her drawing notebooks, which she had left open on the table. "You have talent," he commented, carefully turning the pages. "Who taught you?" Clara stirred the soup, avoiding his gaze. "No one. I've always liked to draw." Jack stopped at a particular drawing, a portrait of himself working in the stable, with a concentrated expression he rarely showed in the presence of others. "You see me differently," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Clara left the wooden spoon and approached, contemplating the drawing with him. "I draw what I see," she responded simply. That night, after Jack retired to sleep, Clara added a new drawing to her secret collection. Vernon Hale, with vulture eyes flying over lands that would never be his. Some demons, she had learned, are better exercised with ink and paper. The light blue dress slid over her head like a cascade of sky. Clara looked in the cracked mirror, barely recognizing the girl who returned her gaze. The dress, found in a forgotten trunk and hastily adapted with inexpert stitches, had belonged to Amélie. Still too big, despite the adjustments, but it was the prettiest thing she had ever owned. "Are you ready?" Jack's voice came from the living room, unusually nervous. Clara breathed deeply, smoothing out non-existent wrinkles in the dress. They hadn't talked about the change of plans, about why Jack had suddenly decided they would attend the Harvest Festival. He had simply announced it during breakfast, with the same determined expression he wore when he decided to repair something broken. Upon leaving the room, she stopped in her tracks. Jack was standing by the window, wearing an impeccably ironed white shirt and a vest that Clara had secretly dusted off and fixed. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair back, revealing a face that, without the usual veil of neglect, was surprisingly attractive. When he turned and saw her, something shone in his eyes, a mixture of recognition, nostalgia, and something else that Clara couldn't interpret. "You look like her," he said simply, and then, as if embarrassed by the confession, added, "The dress, it fit her the same way." The journey to town transpired mostly in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of the first days. It was a complicit silence, full of unspoken expectations. Clara observed the landscape transformed by twilight, while her fingers played with the pendant Jack had lent her that morning. A simple silver chain with a small horse-shaped charm. "For luck," he had said, avoiding her gaze. Clara had accepted it with an interior reverence, aware of its value, not for its material, but for what it represented. Trust. The center of Dry Creek shone with colored lights and garlands that connected the main buildings. A band played in the square, and couples of all ages danced to the rhythm of melodies that spoke of simpler times. The aroma of homemade food, freshly baked bread and hot cider permeated the air, creating an atmosphere of warmth that contrasted with the usual aridity of the place. Clara felt the gazes as soon as they set foot in the square, whispers that followed their steps, fingers that discreetly pointed. Jack, at her side, kept his head high, although she could feel the tension in his arm when she instinctively took it. Jack McAllister, for all the saints, an older man of robust complexion and a face weathered by the sun, made his way through the crowd. His eyes shone with genuine joy as he extended both arms toward Jack, who, to Clara's surprise, returned the embrace with some rigidity, but without rejection. "Silas," Jack greeted, with a familiarity that Clara had never heard from him. "It's been a while." "3 years, man," exclaimed Silas, giving him a pat on the back. 3 years without setting foot in town. I was beginning to think you had become one of those crazy mountain hermits." Then his gaze fell on Clara, with a kind curiosity devoid of the malice she had detected in others. "And who is this young lady?" "Clara Beauchamp," she responded, extending her hand as she had been taught, with a formality that contrasted with her youth. Silas took her hand delicately, as if it were a fragile relic. "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Beauchamp," he said, with an exaggerated bow that drew an involuntary smile from Clara. "Any friend of this old lone wolf is welcome in Dry Creek." The night progressed with unexpected fluidity. Silas guided them through the festival, introducing them to people who looked at Jack with surprise but without hostility. Clara watched, fascinated, as, little by little, Jack's shell cracked, revealing glimpses of the man he had been before the tragedy. In front of a bonfire, while Jack conversed with former colleagues, Silas sat next to Clara, offering her a cup of hot chocolate. "You know, Jack wasn't always like this," he said, looking at the dancing flames. "When I met him, he was the most cheerful young man in the entire county, always with a joke ready, always willing to help." Clara sipped the chocolate, listening attentively. "And when he met Amélie," Silas shook his head, smiling at the memory. "I never saw a man so hopelessly in love. He wrote her poems, can you believe it? He who had barely read a book in his life, learning French just to impress her. The revelations fell on Clara like raindrops on thirsty land. This Jack, dreamer, passionate, full of life, was a stranger who inhabited the same body as the taciturn man with whom she shared the cabin. What was she like? She asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Amélie. Silas looked at her with an indecipherable expression, as if evaluating whether he should continue. Finally, he sighed. She was pure light, he said, one of those people who illuminate everything in their path. She came from France, you know, fleeing from something or someone, never wanted to talk about it. But here she found her place, her purpose. She was a teacher, like you are now, and she had that way of seeing beauty where no one else could see it. Like you are now. The words resonated in Clara's mind. Did they really see her as a successor, as a replacement? I'm not her, she murmured, almost to herself. Silas placed his wrinkled hand over Clara's with a paternal gentleness. No, you're not, he said, with a quiet wisdom, and that's okay. You're not here to take her place, but to create your own. Later, as the music became slower and couples joined in intimate dances, Clara observed Jack from a distance. He was talking with Dr. Callahan, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw him laugh. A brief laugh, almost shy, as if he had forgotten how to do it and was relearning. And in that moment, as if he felt her gaze, Jack looked up and found her among the crowd. Something passed between them, a silent recognition, an unspoken promise. They were not family by blood nor by law, but in that instant, under the starry sky of Arizona, Clara knew they had begun to build something as strong and real as any traditional bond. On the way back to the cabin, Jack broke the silence. Thank you for accompanying me tonight. Clara looked at him, surprised by the explicit gratitude. Thank you for taking me, she responded. Amélie used to say that festivals were medicine for the soul, he continued, his gaze fixed on the road. I think she was right. Clara smiled in the darkness of the truck, feeling that something important had changed that night. It wasn't just Jack who had begun to heal. She, too, had taken a step out of the shadows that had pursued her for so long. Summer came with implacable fury, turning the air into a thick and burning presence. Clara would wake before dawn, when it was still possible to breathe without feeling that her lungs were burning, and go out to the porch to draw the transition from night to day. Her notebooks filled with dawns, each slightly different from the previous one, a meticulous study of lights and shadows, of promises renewed with each cycle. Jack, following her example, had also begun to rise early. She often found him already working in the stable or sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, contemplating the same horizon that she drew. Sometimes they exchanged words, other times they simply shared the silence, comfortable in that intimacy they had built step by step, day by day. That particular morning, Jack surprised her by appearing with 2 saddled horses. It's time you learn to ride properly, he announced, extending the reins of Luna, the light-coated mare that seemed to have adopted Clara as her favorite. Clara put her notebook aside, unable to hide her enthusiasm. She had ridden a few times, always behind Jack, clinging to his waist as they toured the boundaries of the property. The idea of having her own horse, of learning to direct it, awakened in her an almost forgotten emotion, the pure and simple joy of childhood. However, as she approached Luna, anxiety took hold of her. What if she failed? What if she disappointed Jack? What if— Don't be afraid, he said, correctly interpreting her hesitation. Luna is gentle, and I'll be here. Clara nodded, swallowing. With careful movements, she placed her foot in the stirrup and pushed herself up, just as she had seen Jack do dozens of times. To her surprise, her body seemed to remember movements that her mind had forgotten. She settled into the saddle with a naturalness that surprised even Jack. Have you ridden before? He asked with a raised eyebrow. Clara lowered her gaze, unsure of how much to reveal. A long time ago, she finally responded. There were horses where I lived. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. The stables of the Duval mansion had been her secret refuge, the only place where she felt free. The old stable boy, Pierre, had taught her to ride in secret, on the rare occasions when her presence wasn't required to serve or be exhibited as a shameful curiosity. Jack didn't press. Instead, he showed her how to hold the reins, how to communicate with the animal through subtle knee pressures, how to keep her back straight without tensing it. Clara absorbed each instruction with the intensity of one who has been thirsty for too long. Soon they were riding side by side through the valley that extended behind the cabin, an open space where the wind created waves in the tall grass as if it were a golden sea. Clara felt every muscle of Luna moving beneath her, establishing a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the beats of her own heart. "You have good posture," Jack commented, "as if you were born on a horse." Clara smiled, allowing herself to enjoy the compliment. "I like how it feels," she said, "as if we were one." Jack nodded, understanding perfectly. Amélie used to say that riding a horse was the closest thing to flying without leaving the earth. Clara looked at him sideways. Increasingly, Jack mentioned Amélie without pain completely eclipsing the memories. It was a subtle but significant progress. They rode to a small stream that wound among moss-covered rocks. They dismounted to let the horses drink and sat in the shade of a solitary tree. Jack took from his saddlebag a canteen and a package wrapped in cloth, homemade bread, cheese and apples. "The best food is that eaten outdoors," he said, offering her an apple. Clara accepted it, biting into the fruit with delight. The sweet juice reminded her of the rare, happy moments of her childhood, stolen afternoons in forbidden orchards, laughter shared with the few who treated her as a child and not as a burden. "Jack," she began, gathering courage, "have you ever wanted to leave here? Start over somewhere else?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, but it had been forming in her mind for days. Since the festival, she had noticed looks in the town, whispers that followed her. And on 2 occasions she had seen a black car parked on the road, too luxurious to belong to anyone in Dry Creek. Jack chewed slowly, considering the question. "I thought about it after losing her," he finally responded. "Pack the little that remained and go far away, where no one would know my story." "Why didn't you do it?" Jack looked toward the horizon, where the mountains stood out against the relentlessly blue sky. "Because she is in every corner of this land," he said simply. "In the wind, in the mountains, in every dawn. Leaving would be losing her a second time." Clara nodded, understanding. "The places we inhabit become extensions of ourselves, silent witnesses to our joys and sorrows." "Why do you ask?" inquired Jack, turning to look at her directly. "Are you thinking of leaving?" The vulnerability in his voice surprised Clara. It wasn't just curiosity, there was concern, even fear. "No," she responded quickly. "I was just wondering." But the thought persisted, like a shadow in the periphery of her consciousness. It wasn't a desire to abandon the cabin or Jack. It was the growing fear that her past would catch up with both of them, destroying the fragile peace they had built. That night, in her dreams, Clara saw herself riding through an infinite desert, pursued by shadows that bore the Duval emblem. She woke up screaming names in French, orders and punishments that resonated from the depths of her memory. Jack appeared in the threshold of her room, disheveled and with alarmed eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, maintaining a respectful distance. Clara nodded, though tears ran down her cheeks. "Just a nightmare," she murmured. Jack observed her for a moment, then briefly disappeared. He returned, with a steaming cup of herbal tea. "My mother used to prepare this when I had bad dreams," he said, offering her the cup. "It doesn't make them disappear, but it helps to remember they're already past." Clara accepted the drink, allowing the warmth of the cup to comfort her trembling hands. "She used to say I wasn't a real Beauchamp," she whispered, the words escaping before she could contain them. "Just a shameful remembrance." Jack sat on the edge of the bed, his presence solid and reassuring. "Whoever said that was wrong," he responded firmly. "The only thing that matters is who you decide to be." Clara drank the tea slowly, letting its warmth dissipate the cold of fear. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't constantly fleeing, where she could simply be Clara without surnames that defined or limited her. A future that perhaps included this cabin, these horses, and this silent man who was learning to be a father without having prepared for it. The sky darkened with a disquieting rapidity, as if night had decided to advance several hours. Clara observed from the kitchen window how dense, almost purplish clouds swirled over the mountains, advancing inexorably toward the cabin. The wind had begun to moan, a plaintive sound that seemed to presage something more than simple rain. "It's going to be a strong storm," Jack commented, entering with his arms loaded with firewood. "I've secured the horses in the stable. We'll be fine here." Clara nodded, although an inexplicable nervousness had settled in her stomach. There was something in the air, an electricity that didn't relate solely to the imminent storm. While helping Jack close shutters and strategically place candles around the cabin, her thoughts constantly drifted to that small diary hidden under her mattress, to the words written by a woman who had tried to find her long before she herself knew she needed to be found. The first thunders rumbled like distant war drums. The rain wasn't long in unleashing, first as a murmur on the roof, then as a constant bombardment. The lights flickered several times before definitely surrendering, plunging the cabin into a dimness, broken only by the occasional glow of lightning and the golden light of candles. Jack lit the fireplace, and the fire projected dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Clara sat on the floor, hugging her knees, hypnotized by the flames that seemed to tell stories encoded in their incessant dance. "Don't be afraid," said Jack, misinterpreting her absorption. "The cabin has withstood worse storms." Clara looked at him with a faint smile. "I'm not afraid of the storm," she responded, though she didn't explain what she was really afraid of. Jack nodded without pressing. He sat in his favorite armchair, a worn book in his hands, though his eyes didn't seem to focus on the words. Clara knew that storms awakened painful memories in him. The night Amélie disappeared had been precisely during a similar storm. As the night progressed and the storm increased its ferocity, Clara felt a growing restlessness, an inexplicable impulse for movement. When Jack got up to check the windows again, she slipped toward the small attic that served as storage, a space she had never thoroughly explored. The ladder creaked under her feet, but the roar of the storm masked the sound. Upstairs, in almost total dimness, Clara lit a small flashlight she had taken from the kitchen. The beam of light revealed Dusty. Trunks, stacked boxes, and objects covered with sheets that adopted ghostly forms. She moved carefully among the stored memories of past lives. Each object seemed to contain a story: a stopped pendulum clock, a collection of antique hats, photographs in ornate frames. Clara stopped in front of a particularly elegant trunk, with initials engraved on the lid, A.M. Amélie McAllister. She hesitated for a moment, aware of crossing a boundary she had respected until now, but something stronger than prudence guided her hands when she lifted the trunk's lid. The interior was meticulously organized: dresses folded with care, letters tied with ribbons, small jewelry boxes. In a corner, a photo album showed captured moments of happiness: Jack and Amélie at their wedding, both radiant, excursions to the mountains, Amélie with Dr. Callahan in front of a building that Clara recognized as the projected home for children. Between the pages of the album, an envelope sealed with red wax. Clara extracted it carefully. It was addressed simply to J, the elegant handwriting unmistakably similar to that of the diary. Under the envelope, something shone, catching the flashlight's light: a silver medallion with the initials A.M. engraved in relief. Clara took it between her fingers, feeling its weight, its history. It was a beautiful object in its simplicity: an oval, with an intricate floral design around the initials. An irresistible impulse led her to open it. Inside, 2 miniatures. On one side, a portrait of Jack, younger and smiling. On the other, an empty space, as if waiting for an image that never came to occupy it. Without thinking, Clara hung it around her neck, feeling its weight against her chest, like an anchor to a story that mysteriously intertwined with her own. The medallion seemed warm against her skin, as if it preserved something of the spirit of its original owner. A particularly violent thunder shook the cabin, startling her. The flashlight slipped from her, hands rolling under a cabinet. As she bent to retrieve it, Clara discovered a flat box hidden behind the furniture. She extracted it carefully, attracted by the family shield engraved on the lid, the Duval emblem, the same stylized cross that marked her own skin as a shameful secret. Inside the box, documents, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, headlines about the death of the Duval patriarch, rumors about an illegitimate daughter, investigations about properties in Arizona, and a photograph Amélie next to the entrance of the Duval mansion in France with a determined expression. On the reverse, a date and a brief note: "I'll find her. For you, A." Jack's voice from downstairs startled her. Quickly, she put the documents back in the box, leaving it where she had found it. She only kept the medallion, which she hid under her blouse. "I'm here," she responded, hurriedly descending the ladder. "Just looking for more blankets." When she entered the living room, Jack was observing her with an indecipherable expression. His eyes stopped on the outline of the medallion, visible under the fabric of her blouse. "You found it," he said, and it wasn't a question. Clara felt her heart accelerate. Instinctively, her hand rose to the medallion as if protecting it. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." Jack shook his head, interrupting her. He approached slowly, and with surprising delicacy, extracted the medallion from under her blouse, holding it between his fingers without taking it from around her neck. "It was her most prized possession," he murmured. "She always carried it with her. The only thing they never found after." His voice broke. When he raised his gaze to Clara, his eyes were wet. "You know, for a second when I saw you with it," he shook his head as if shooing away an absurd thought. "You look so much like her sometimes. Not physically, but in your spirit." Clara felt tears accumulating in her eyes. She wanted to tell him everything. The diary, Amélie's investigations, the truth about her origin. But fear paralyzed her. What if he rejected her upon knowing who she really was? What if the Duvals found her? Instead of speaking, she took Jack's hands in hers, a gesture she had never before dared to make. They were rough from hard work, but surprisingly warm. "Amélie saved me without knowing it," she finally said, each word loaded with the weight of half-truths. "And now you have saved me again." Jack looked at her fixedly, as if searching for something in her eyes. Finally he nodded as if reaching an internal decision. "Keep it," he said, referring to the medallion. "I think she would have wanted you to have it." That night, as the storm gradually subsided, Clara remained awake, the medallion warm against her skin. In the adjacent room she could hear Jack moving, equally sleepless. Two souls connected by an absence, by a destiny that seemed to have been traced long before they were aware of it. Outside, the sky began to clear. Stars appeared between scattered shreds of clouds. Clara thought about the documents hidden in the attic, about the sealed envelope she hadn't dared to open, buried secrets that, like seeds after the rain, were beginning to germinate. The black car appeared again, this time parked directly in front of the school. Clara noticed it immediately upon leaving class, its impeccable shine contrasting with the omnipresent dust of Dry Creek. It wasn't Vernon Hale's car. This one emanated an air of European elegance that was absolutely out of place in that forgotten corner of Arizona. Next to the vehicle, a man in a dark suit smoked with studied indolence. His eyes, protected by sunglasses despite the cloudy day, followed the movements of the children leaving the building. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine when that hidden gaze settled on her. "Clara, everything okay?" Miss Jenkins had approached, noticing her sudden immobility. "Yes," she responded automatically, although her instinct screamed the opposite. "I was just thinking." The teacher followed her gaze to the stranger. "It's the third time this week I've seen that car," she commented, with a casual tone that didn't completely disguise her concern. "Do you know him?" Clara shook her head, clutching her notebook as if it were a shield. "I've never seen him before," she lied, aware that those eyes were disturbingly familiar, although she couldn't see them directly. Miss Jenkins placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "I'll accompany you to the store. Jack will pick you up there, right?" Clara nodded, grateful. During the short journey to the general store, she constantly felt the stranger's gaze following her, like a physical weight on her neck. It wasn't the first time she had experienced that sensation. In the Duval mansion, there were always watchful eyes. There were always consequences for every misstep. Jack was waiting outside the store, conversing with Dr. Callahan. Both interrupted their chat upon seeing her approach, and Clara couldn't help but notice the exchange of concerned looks between them. "Ready to go?" asked Jack, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. On the way back, Clara remained silent, contemplating the familiar landscape that paraded behind the window. Since the storm, 2 weeks ago, something had changed between her and Jack. It wasn't just the small things, like the fact that they now dined together every night, or that he had begun to teach her to shoot. Just in case. It was something deeper, a nascent trust that slowly blossomed like the rare flowers of the desert after the rain. However, that same period had brought with it disquieting signs. The black car, whispers in town about strangers asking questions, and the growing hostility of Vernon Hale, who seemed more determined than ever to obtain Jack's lands. "We have a visitor," Jack suddenly announced, reducing speed. Clara leaned forward, feeling her heart stop. In front of the cabin, 2 vehicles were parked, the unmistakable car of the sheriff and an elegant automobile she didn't recognize. Jack stopped the truck at some distance, his knuckles white from the pressure on the steering wheel. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice tense. "If anything happens, take Luna's reins and ride north to Silas's cabin. Understood?" Clara nodded, though fear formed a knot in her throat that threatened to suffocate her. Jack exited the vehicle and walked with determination toward the visitors. From her position, Clara could see Sheriff Tanner, a corpulent man with a perpetually tired expression, and Vernon Hale, whose predatory smile was visible even from a distance. Next to them, a third man, thin and elegant, with a briefcase in hand. Clara couldn't hear the conversation, but the tension was palpable even from afar. Jack remained erect, his posture defensive, while the man with the briefcase gestured vehemently, occasionally pointing toward the cabin. After what seemed like an eternity, the 3 men left. Jack remained motionless, observing them depart before returning to the truck. His face was pale, a rigid mask of control that barely contained an evident fury. "What's happening?" asked Clara, when he sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Jack breathed deeply before responding. "Vernon has presented a legal challenge about my lands," he finally said. "He alleges that, after Amelie's disappearance, the property should have passed to inheritance review, since she was co-owner." Clara processed the information, understanding the implications. "Can they take the land from you?" Jack hit the steering wheel with contained frustration. "Not legally. I have all the papers in order. But Vernon has influence, and money for lawyers that I can't afford." He started the engine and drove the last meters to the cabin in silence. Once inside, Jack went directly to a sideboard, extracting a bottle of whiskey that Clara had never seen him drink. He served himself a glass but didn't drink it. He simply contemplated it, as if seeking answers in the amber liquid. "There's something else," he finally said, without looking at her. "The man with the briefcase doesn't work for Vernon. He's a private investigator hired by the Duval family." The name fell like a stone in a pond, sending waves of panic through Clara. The medallion, hidden under her dress, suddenly seemed to become heavy, as if it wanted to drag her to the ground. What do they want?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. Jack looked at her then directly with an intensity that pierced through her. "They're looking for a girl," he responded, "a missing heiress. According to him, the last person who investigated her whereabouts was Amelie, before her death." A dense silence settled between them, charged with unformulated questions. Clara could feel Jack's gaze studying her, connecting dots, perhaps reaching the truth she had tried to hide. "Clara," he finally said, his voice surprisingly soft, "is there something you want to tell me?" The question floated in the air like a fragile bubble. Clara felt that the world was reduced to that moment, to that room, to the decision she had to make. Lie again, risking losing the trust that had cost so much to build, or reveal the truth, knowing that it could change everything. She began, but the words got stuck in her throat. Jack approached, kneeling in front of her to be at her height. There was no accusation in his eyes, only a genuine concern that broke something inside Clara. "Whatever it is, we can face it together," he said, with a certainty that disarmed Clara's last defenses. "But I need to know what we're up against." Clara closed her eyes, breathing deeply. When she opened them, she had made her decision. "I'm not who you think I am," she said, each word weighing like lead. "My real name is Clara Duval. I am the illegitimate daughter of Etienne Duval, and a servant of the house. For years I was raised as a family shame, hidden from the view of all except those who had to watch me." The words flowed now, released after being contained for so long. "When old Duval died, my uncle decided that I didn't deserve even that anymore. He planned to send me to a boarding school in Switzerland, one that specializes in correcting problematic girls. So I escaped, and I found this." She extracted from her pocket the folded and worn piece of paper, the coordinates of the cabin written in the same elegant handwriting as the diary, as the letters in the attic. "Amelie was looking for me," she concluded, her voice broken with emotion. "I don't know how she found me or why, but she left this map for me. She guided me here, to you." Jack took the paper with trembling fingers, immediately recognizing his wife's handwriting. His face went through a succession of emotions: surprise, confusion, understanding, and finally, an iron determination. "The Duvals will not take you back," he declared with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "Not while I live." Clara felt that the tears, so long contained, began to flow freely. Jack, in a gesture that seemed as natural as it was unexpected, wrapped her in his arms. It was the first time he had embraced her, and Clara allowed herself to sink into that improvised refuge, feeling for the first time in her life that she had truly found a home. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky with reddish tones that presaged a storm. Shadows lengthened over the land, but inside the cabin, two wounded souls had found at last the truth that would unite them against any threat the future might bring. Dawn found Clara packing her few belongings. Each movement was deliberate, each object carefully selected: the drawing notebook, a change of clothes, Amelie's diary, a small knife Jack had given her for wood carving, though both knew it was for protection, the essentials for one who must depart. Without looking back, the decision had crystallized during the night, while she listened to Jack move around the cabin, preparing for what seemed inevitable: a confrontation with the Duvals, with Vernon, with the past that refused to remain buried. She had heard his phone conversations, his attempts to contact a lawyer in Phoenix, his growing frustration at the certainty that he was fighting against adversaries with practically unlimited resources. Clara knew what she had to do. She had known it since the moment she saw the black car in front of the school, perhaps even before. Her presence endangered not only the peace Jack had begun to rebuild, but the cabin itself, the lands that were his connection to Amélie, his sustenance and his refuge. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when she finished preparing her small bundle. Jack was finally sleeping, after a night of insomnia. Clara moved in absolute silence. Years of practice, dodging unwanted gazes, now converted into a skill for saying goodbye without being noticed. On the kitchen table she left two objects, a drawing and a note. The drawing showed Jack and her riding together, with mountains in the background and the bright sun over their heads, an alternative future that perhaps would never come to be realized. The note was brief, the words carefully chosen to cause the least possible pain. "Thank you for teaching me what it means to have a home. I'm leaving to protect yours. Don't look for me. I will always remember our shared dawns, Clara." She hesitated a moment before signing with her real name, finally opting for the one Jack knew. Perhaps Clara Beauchamp didn't exist legally, but she was more real than any identity imposed by birth or circumstance. She exited through the back door, avoiding the boards that creaked. The fresh morning air greeted her with its rough caress, a last embrace from this land she had learned to love. She headed to the stable, where Luna greeted her with a soft whinny of recognition. "Shh, pretty one," she whispered, caressing her neck. "Today you can't come with me." Instead of saddling the mare, Clara limited herself to caressing her one last time before beginning to walk toward the road. The weight of the improvised backpack was light on her shoulders, but that of the medallion against her chest seemed to have multiplied, as if it contained not only metal, but also all the hopes and dreams she left behind. The plan was simple: reach the crossroads before noon, take the bus that passed heading west, lose herself in some city large enough to dilute among the crowd. She had some money, saved from small jobs in town, and from coins found in forgotten pockets. It wasn't much, but she had survived with less. As she walked, the sun slowly ascended, turning the morning mist into a golden veil that transformed the arid landscape into something almost magical. Clara allowed herself to look back once, just once, to engrave in her memory the silhouette of the cabin outlined against the rosy sky of dawn. She didn't expect to feel this pain, this sensation of tearing something vital from her entrails. In the months that had passed since her arrival, that dilapidated construction had become much more than a temporary refuge. It had become home, promise, possibility. And Jack had gone from being a gruff stranger to becoming the most important person in her life. It wasn't just gratitude she felt toward him. It was a deep affection, a bond, forged in shared silences, in lessons learned, in trust slowly earned, stone upon stone. Precisely for that reason she had to leave, because the Duvals wouldn't stop, because Vernon would see in her the perfect opportunity to pressure Jack, because staying meant becoming a weapon that others would use against the man who had given her. without asking for it or expecting it, the only thing she had always desired, to belong. The crossroads appeared sooner than expected, or perhaps her thoughts had distorted her perception of time. She sat on a rock to wait, calculating that it would be at least 2 hours before the bus passed. The sun was already punishing with force, and Clara appreciated the canteen she had had the foresight to fill. It was then that she heard it, the unmistakable sound of horse hooves approaching at a full gallop. Her heart accelerated. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was, to recognize the particular rhythm of Shadow when he ran at full speed. She remained motionless, debating between the secret hope she had harbored, that he would find her, that he would stop her, and the rational conviction that leaving was the right thing, the necessary thing, the only possible thing. Jack stopped Shadow a few meters away, dismounting with an agility that contrasted with his agitated breathing. Clara didn't turn. She didn't trust her resolution if she had to face his gaze. "You can't leave like this," he said, his voice hoarse from the effort, or perhaps something more. "It's not fair." Clara clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms to distract herself from the deeper pain. "It's best for everyone," she responded, keeping her gaze fixed on the dusty horizon. "The Duvals will leave if I'm not here. Vernon won't have anything to pressure you with." Jack approached, stopping in front of her, forcing her to look at him. His face showed evidence of a sleepless night, but his eyes burned with a determination that Clara had never seen. "And who decides what's best?" he asked, with an intensity that overwhelmed her. "You alone, without consulting me, without giving me a voice in a decision that affects us both?" Clara had no answer for that. She hadn't considered that her departure could be seen as a betrayal, as a lack of trust in Jack's ability to protect what he considered his. "I don't want to be a burden," she finally murmured. "I don't want you to lose everything because of me." Jack knelt before her, taking her hands in his, the gesture that had become natural between them in recent weeks. "Clara, look at me," he asked, and when she did, he continued, "I won't lose you, not again." The words hung suspended between them, loaded with superimposed meanings. It wasn't just about her, Clara knew. It was about Amelie, about abandonment, about loneliness. "I can't allow you to sacrifice everything for me," she insisted, although her resolution was beginning to crack. "The lands, the cabin, your entire life. None of that matters if I'm alone," Jack responded simply. "Believe me, I've lived it. I don't intend to return to that darkness." The sun reached its zenith, projecting minimal shadows under their feet. In the distance, dust announced the approach of a vehicle. The bus, thought Clara, and for the first time the possibility of boarding it seemed painful instead of liberating. "What if they come for me?" she asked, giving voice to her deepest fear. "The Duvals are powerful. They have connections, money." Jack smiled, a smile she hadn't seen before. Wolf-like, fierce, protective. "Then they'll discover that some things can't be bought," he said, "like the support of an entire town." Clara looked at him without understanding. Jack extracted a folded paper from his pocket, a special edition of the local newspaper. The headline read, "Neighbors unite to defend local family from foreign speculators. Dr. Callahan, Silas, even Miss Jenkins. They're all on our side," he explained, passing her the newspaper. "Vernon made the mistake of threatening to close the school if the town didn't pressure me to sell my lands. He didn't calculate well the appreciation Dry Creek has for its only teacher." Clara quickly read the article, which mentioned how the inhabitants of Dry Creek had formed a legal defense committee, raising funds to hire a lawyer to represent the McAllister family. "The McAllister family?" she read aloud, feeling a knot in her throat. Jack averted his gaze, suddenly shy. "That's how the town sees you," he said. "How I see you." The bus was approaching, now clearly visible in the distance. Clara had less than a minute to decide. Get on and disappear forever, or return and face whatever came, alongside Jack, alongside the town that had surprisingly adopted her as one of their own. "I can't promise you it will be easy," said Jack, following the direction of her gaze. "I can only promise you that you won't be alone, never again." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the medallion against her chest. What would Amelie have done in her place? The answer came with crystal clarity. She would have fought for her home, for her own, for what was right. When she opened her eyes, her decision was made. She stood up, picking up her bundle, and extended her hand to Jack. "Let's go home," she said simply. The bus passed by, raising a cloud of dust that seemed to carry away with it the last vestiges of doubt. They mounted together, Clara in front, Jack behind. As so many times they had ridden through the hills, but this time, as shadow carried them back to the cabin, Clara didn't cling to Jack for fear of falling. She did it because she had finally found her place in the world, next to him, in that cabin rebuilt with trust and courage, facing the future with the certainty that whatever happened, she was no longer alone. Winter descended upon Arizona with unexpected ferocity. The mountains, usually brown and reddish, awoke one day covered by a white mantle that completely transformed the landscape. The cabin, with its snow-covered roof and constantly lit fireplace, seemed taken from a Christmas postcard instead of the arid reality of the desert. Clara contemplated the transformation from the kitchen window, marveled by how the snow softened the rugged contours, turning the familiar into something magical and new. Her fingers, reddened by the cold despite the interior warmth of the cabin, absent-mindedly drew frost patterns on the foggy. Silas. The last 2 months had passed in a strange calm. After her failed attempt to flee, Clara and Jack had established a new routine, more solid, more conscious. The entire town seemed to have become a protective shield around them. The legal committee had hired a lawyer from Phoenix who quickly dismantled Vernon's claims. The Duvals, for their part, had maintained a vigilant distance, like predators studying their prey before attacking. "It's going to snow more tonight," commented Jack, entering the kitchen with his arms loaded with firewood. "We'd better check the provisions." Clara nodded, moving away from the window to help him. They worked in synchrony now, each anticipating the other's movements, as if they had been sharing space and tasks for years. Jack stacked the wood next to the fireplace, while Clara checked the pantry, making a mental inventory of what they had. "I think we'll be fine for a week," she said, closing the cupboard, "as long as the storm doesn't last." "Longer than that," Jack smiled, shaking the snowflakes from his jacket. "In my 30 years here, I've never seen a snowstorm last more than 4 days." Clara returned his smile, grateful for these small moments of normality. The last weeks had brought subtle but significant changes in their relationship. Jack was no longer just her protector. He had become her teacher, her confidant, her family, and she, for her part, had stopped seeing herself as a fugitive to begin feeling like what the newspaper had proclaimed, part of the McAllister family. The rest of the day passed in preparations for the announced storm. Jack reinforced the windows and secured the stable, while Clara baked bread and prepared stews that could easily be reheated if the electricity failed. By nightfall, when the first flakes began to fall again, the cabin was ready to resist any onslaught from the weather. They dined by the fire, in a comfortable silence occasionally interrupted by the crackling of the flames, or the growing howl of the wind. Jack read a worn book by Jack London, appropriately about survival in snowy territories, while Clara drew in her notebook, capturing the serenity of that moment, the golden light of the fire projecting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. It was then they heard it, an insistent knocking at the door, almost drowned by the wind but unmistakable in its urgency. Jack and Clara exchanged alarmed looks. No one in their right mind would be outside in this weather, unless it was an emergency. Or unless... Jack stood up, gesturing for Clara to remain where she was. He approached the door cautiously, previously taking the rifle he always kept loaded since the Duvals had appeared in their lives. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice firm despite the evident tension in his shoulders. "Sheriff Tanner," responded a voice muffled by the storm. "We have a situation, McAllister." Jack opened the door slightly, keeping the rifle visible but lowered. The icy wind immediately slipped in, bringing with it snowflakes and the imposing figure of the sheriff, covered in white from head to toe. "What's happening?" asked Jack, stepping aside to allow him to enter. The sheriff shook off the snow before responding, his eyes quickly evaluating the room until settling on Clara, who had stood up, alert. "Strangers," he finally said. "3 men in a luxury car, asking specifically for the girl. They're not subtle, and they don't seem to care about the storm." Clara felt her heart accelerate. The Duvals had finally decided to move to direct action. "Where are they now?" asked Jack, his voice controlled despite the evident fury in his eyes. "Silas has diverted them northward, making them believe the cabin is in that direction," responded the sheriff. "But it won't take them long to discover the deception, especially when the snow subsides." Jack nodded, processing the information. "What's your suggestion, Tanner?" The sheriff looked directly at Clara before responding. "That the girl come with me now. I'll take her to Dr. Callahan's house. It's the last place they would look, and Esther has a well-hidden basement that has served as a refuge before." Clara instinctively shook her head, taking a step toward Jack. "I won't go," she declared with a firmness that surprised even herself. "I won't separate from Jack." The sheriff sighed, as if he had anticipated this response. "McAllister, be reasonable. These men are not like Vernon. They don't seek to negotiate. They have clear orders and the means to fulfill them." Jack remained silent for a moment, his gaze meeting Clara's in a silent conversation. Finally, he shook his head. "I appreciate your concern, Tanner, but Clara is right. We won't separate. If they come, we'll face them together." The sheriff seemed to want to protest, but something in Jack's expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded resignedly. "Then I'll have to manage to divert them as long as possible," he said, heading back toward the door. "Be careful, McAllister, and you too, little one." After the sheriff's departure, Jack reinforced the locks and checked the rifle again. Clara observed him, divided between fear and a strange calm. Part of her wanted to flee, to disappear into the storm to protect Jack. But another part, the one that had grown and found its courage in these months, knew that fleeing wasn't the answer. "You should sleep," said Jack, noticing her gaze. "You'll need strength." Clara shook her head. "I couldn't sleep knowing they're out there." Jack studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then let's keep watch together." They prepared coffee and sat by the window, observing the snow fall increasingly thick, turning the exterior world into an impenetrable white curtain. The storm had intensified, howling around the cabin like a hungry beast. "Jack," Clara began after a long silence, "if they come for me, I don't want them to hurt you." Jack looked at her with an intensity that almost hurt. "I won't let them take you," he responded simply. "But they're dangerous and powerful and we have something they don't," he interrupted with a faint smile. "We belong here. This land, this cabin, this place. It's our home, and some things are worth defending." Clara felt tears accumulating in her eyes, not from fear but from gratitude. Throughout her life she had been an intruder, an uncomfortable presence, something to hide or exhibit according to convenience. Never, until now, had she truly felt that she belonged to a place, to a person. "Thank you," she whispered, the words insufficient to express the depth of her feeling, or everything. Jack extended his hand across the table, and Clara took it without hesitation. They needed no more words. The night advanced and fatigue began to take its toll on Clara. Despite her efforts, her eyelids became increasingly heavy. Jack, noticing it, wrapped her with a blanket. "Rest," he murmured. "I'll keep watch." Clara wanted to protest, but the warmth of the blanket and the emotional exhaustion inexorably dragged her toward a restless slumber. Her dreams were fragmented, chaotic images where faceless figures pursued her through a snowy forest, while the medallion on her chest shone like a guiding star in the darkness. She awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented. The room was in half light, illuminated only by the dying embers of the fireplace. Jack wasn't beside her. An irrational panic took hold of Clara until she heard noises coming from the kitchen, the tinkling of cups, cautious steps. She rose silently, still wrapped in the blanket. Through the window, she saw that the storm had subsided, though snow continued to fall in lazy flakes. The exterior darkness was beginning to dilute into a pale gray that announced dawn. "Jack," she called softly, entering the kitchen. She found him preparing coffee, his face marked by the vigil, but his eyes alert. When he saw her, a tired smile briefly illuminated his features. "Good morning," he said, offering her a steaming cup. "I didn't want to wake you." Clara accepted the coffee, feeling how the warmth spread from her hands to the rest of her body, momentarily chasing away the cold and fear. "Have they come?" she asked, though Jack's calm suggested there had been no confrontation during the night. "No," he responded, looking toward the window. "The storm has been our best defense, but—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Both knew that the respite was temporary. When the roads cleared, when the snow began to melt, the Duval men would return. And this time, neither the sheriff nor the storm could stop them. They breakfasted in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts. Clara observed Jack discreetly, noticing the new grey hairs that had appeared at his temples, the deeper wrinkles around his eyes. She wondered how much of that accelerated aging was a result of her presence in his life, how many worries she had brought him. "Stop doing that," Jack suddenly said, surprising her. "Doing what?" "Blaming yourself," he responded, with an intuition that demonstrated how well he had come to know her. "You're not responsible for the actions of the Duvals, nor for Vernon's, nor for mine." Clara lowered her gaze, embarrassed by being so transparent. "I just wish everything were different," she murmured, "that we could simply live." Jack nodded, understanding the depth of that seemingly simple desire. "We will," he promised, with a conviction that almost convinced her. "When this is over." After breakfast, Jack prepared to go out to check the stable and ensure that the horses were well after the storm. Clara insisted on accompanying him, unable to bear the idea of separating, even for a brief period. The exterior world was a transformed landscape, of an almost painful beauty. The immaculate snow covered everything, absorbing sounds, creating a sensation of absolute isolation. Their boots sank into the fresh snow, leaving perfect tracks that marked their path from the cabin to the stable. The horses greeted them with whinnies of recognition. They seemed restless, as if perceiving the tension in the environment. Jack checked them one by one, speaking to them in a low voice, reassuring them with expert caresses. Clara occupied herself with changing the frozen water for fresh water, grateful for the task that kept her hands and mind occupied. It was then that Shadow, usually the calmest of the horses, began to nervously paw the ground, his ears turning toward the entrance of the stable. Jack and Clara exchanged looks. Something or someone was approaching. With a gesture, Jack indicated to Clara that she should remain at the back of the stable, while he cautiously approached the door, his hand instinctively seeking the knife he always carried on his belt. He peered through a crack between the boards, his body visibly tensing. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice a tense whisper. "Don't. Come out until I return." Before Clara could protest, Jack had exited, firmly closing the door behind him. Clara remained motionless, her heart beating painfully against her ribs. Through the cracks, she tried to see what was happening, but the resplendent snow blinded her. She could only distinguish shadows moving, dark figures against the immaculate white. Voices reached her, muffled by distance and wood. Jack's, firm but controlled, another, deeper, with an accent she immediately recognized as French. The Duvals had arrived. Time stretched interminably while Clara remained hidden, debating between obedience to Jack and the impulse to go out, to face herself, those who pursued her. Wasn't that what she had learned in these months? To face her fears, not to flee. The decision was made for her when the stable door abruptly opened. It wasn't Jack who entered, but a tall, thin man, impeccably dressed despite the weather, with a face that seemed sculpted in ice, sharp features, cold gray, eyes, thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval. "Clara," he said with a voice that contained decades of unquestioned authority. Or should I say, Clarice Duval. She stood up straight, facing that gaze that had so many times made her feel insignificant. She was no longer the frightened girl who had fled months ago. This cabin, this place, this time with Jack, had transformed her. "My name is Clara Beauchamp," she responded, with a calmness that surprised even herself. "And you're on private property, Mr. Duval." The man, her uncle, though she had never called him that, seemed momentarily disoriented by her response. He expected to find a trembling girl, not this young woman with a firm gaze and secure voice. "You've changed," he observed, studying her with clinical eyes. "The country air seems to have been good for you." Clara didn't respond. Her silence was now a choice, not an imposition. "Your presence here has caused considerable inconveniences," he continued, walking slowly through the stable, as if evaluating a property for sale. "I imagine you're not aware of the legal situation in which you've placed this man who has sheltered you." "Jack hasn't done anything wrong," Clara responded, concern filtering into her voice despite her efforts. Her uncle smiled, a cold smile that never reached his eyes. Kidnapping, perhaps, or at least complicity in the escape of a minor under legal guardianship. The fear that Clara had kept at bay began to expand in her chest. She wasn't afraid for herself, but for Jack. How far would the Duvals go to recover her? What lies would they construct? What strings would they pull? "No one kidnapped me," she said with a firm voice. "I escaped from a place where I was mistreated, where I was a shameful secret hidden from everyone's view." Her uncle looked at her with genuine surprise, as if he had never considered her feelings as something relevant. "You were a Duval," he responded, as if that explained everything. "Although born in unfortunate circumstances, we gave you a home, education, a future. You gave me a prison," interrupted Clara, years of contained resentment flowing like an overflowing river. "You raised me like a servant who should be grateful for the crumbs of recognition, until you decided that I didn't even deserve that." The man narrowed his eyes, all pretense of kindness evaporating. "Enough," he snapped. "I haven't come to argue with a child. I've come to take you back to the place you belong. She's already where she belongs." Jack's voice resonated from the entrance of the stable. He was standing, his figure outlined against the exterior light, the rifle in his hands, not directly pointing at the intruder, but making his intention clear. Mr. Duval turned slowly, evaluating the newcomer with the arrogance of one who knows himself backed by generations of power and wealth. "Mr. McAllister, I presume," he said, with barely disguised disdain. "My men have told me about you, a widower living in this place forgotten by God, raising alone a girl who isn't yours. The authorities would find the situation, at minimum, questionable." Jack didn't take the bait. He maintained his position, his gaze fixed on the intruder. "The local authorities know our situation perfectly," he responded, "and they support it. But you already know that, don't you? That's why you've come directly, instead of using official channels." A tense silence settled between both men. Clara could feel the clash of wills, the confrontation between two types of strength, that of power and money against that of conviction and love. "This won't end today," Mr. Duval finally said, adjusting his gloves with studied indifference. "The Duvals always recover what's ours." "Clara is not a possession," Jack responded, his voice low but intense. "She's a person, with the right to choose her own path." Mr. Duval emitted a short laugh without humor. "How touching, almost poetic. But the reality, Mr. McAllister, is that the laws are on our side. She is a minor and we are her legal family." He paused, looking directly at Clara. "Enjoy your rural idyll while you can, Clarice. We'll return. And next time, it won't be a social visit." With those words, he turned on his heel and left the stable, leaving behind a silence charged with unspoken threats. Jack maintained his position until the sounds of an engine indicated that the intruder had departed. Only then did he lower the rifle and quickly approach Clara. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face for signs of distress. Clara nodded, though she felt her legs might fail her at any moment. The adrenaline was beginning to dissipate, leaving in its place a tremor that was born in her core and extended to her extremities. Jack guided her to a bale of hay, helping her to sit. Then, without words, he wrapped her in a protective embrace. Clara allowed herself to sink into that refuge, breathing the familiar aroma of wood and leather that she would always associate with security. "He was right about one thing," she finally murmured. "They won't give up." Jack gently moved her away, taking her face between his weathered hands so that she would look at him directly. "Neither will we," he declared with an unshakable conviction. "You're not alone in this, Clara. You'll never be again." They remained like that for a moment, strengthening each other mutually. Then, as if they had reached a tacit agreement, they rose and exited the stable together, facing the blinding whiteness of the snowy day. The sun had begun to melt the snow, creating tiny rivulets that wound between the tracks left by the intruders. Clara observed how nature was already beginning to erase those marks of the unwanted presence, reclaiming its territory. Perhaps, she thought, they too could resist. Perhaps time, love, and determination would be enough to face what was coming. As they walked toward the cabin, Clara slipped her hand into Jack's, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The medallion against her chest seemed lighter now, as if it had fulfilled part of its purpose in bringing her here, to this man, to this life she would defend with all her strength. Spring came to Arizona with an explosion of color that seemed a miracle after the monotonous white of winter. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides, cacti bloomed with improbable crowns of pink and yellow, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with renewed energy. In the cabin, which could no longer be called dilapidated after months of constant repairs, Clara contemplated her reflection in the mirror newly hung in her room. The blue dress, now perfectly fitted to her figure after Mrs. Henderson's modifications, made her appear older than her 12 years, or perhaps it was the expression in her eyes, which had seen too much for her age. Today was an important day. Dr. Callahan had finally found the documents they were seeking. Adoption papers initiated by Amélie before her disappearance, documents that could be the key to legally facing the Duvals. It wasn't a guarantee, she had warned them, but it was a beginning, a foundation upon which to build their defense. "Ready?" Jack's voice came from the living room, as nervous as her own would have sounded if she had responded aloud. Clara breathed deeply, adjusting the medallion she now rarely removed. Since Mr. Duval's visit 2 months ago, they had lived in a state of constant alert. The Duval men occasionally appeared in Dry Creek, asking questions, observing, making their presence felt like a silent threat. Vernon Hale, frustrated by the failure of his initial plans, had found convenient allies in them. "Ready?" she responded, finally leaving the room. Jack waited for her by the door, dressed in his best shirt and with freshly cut hair. He too seemed different, more erect, more determined, as if the months of constant struggle had awakened in him a strength that had remained dormant during his period of mourning. The journey to the lawyer's office in Phoenix was long but peaceful. Clara observed the landscape transformed by spring, thinking about how much her life had changed in the last year. From being a shadow in the Duval mansion, she had become an essential part of this new improvised family, of this community that had welcomed her as one of their own. Phoenix was a hive of activity compared to the tranquility of Dry Creek. Clara felt intimidated by the tall buildings, the incessant traffic, the accelerated rhythm of the city. Jack seemed to share her discomfort, his shoulders visibly tensing as they navigated the bustling streets. Hammond & Associates law firm occupied an elegant but discreet building in the center of the city. The lawyer, Richard Hammond, received them personally, a middle-aged man with metal-framed glasses and a smile that immediately inspired confidence. "Mr. McAllister, Miss Beauchamp," he greeted, shaking their hands firmly. "Dr. Callahan has informed me of your situation. Please take a seat." The office was decorated with sobriety, shelves full of law books, an impeccably organized desk, framed photographs showing the lawyer with what Clara assumed was his family, a space that spoke of order and competence. "Before we begin," said Hammond, settling behind his desk, "I want to be completely transparent. The legal situation is complicated." Jack nodded, his hand instinctively seeking Clara's. "We understand," he responded. "We just want to know if there's any possibility." Hammond extracted a folder with documents from a drawer, meticulously arranging them on the desk. "The papers initiated by Mrs. McAllister are a point in your favor," he began, indicating the documents that Dr. Callahan had discovered. "They demonstrate a clear intention of adoption and suggest that there was a prior investigation into Clara's situation in the Duval family." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "However, the fact that these proceedings remained unfinished after the disappearance of Mrs. McAllister makes them circumstantial evidence rather than legally binding documents." Clara felt that her initial hope was beginning to vanish. Jack gently squeezed her hand, transmitting strength to her. "On the other hand," continued Hammond, and something in his tone made Clara pay attention again, "we have several elements in our favor. First, Clara's clear will to remain with you, Mr. McAllister. At her age, the testimony of a minor already has considerable weight in the courts." He extracted another document, this one more recent. "Second, the letters of support from the Dry Creek community, especially that of Dr. Callahan and Miss Jenkins, who attest to Clara's physical and emotional well-being under your care." "And the Duvals?" asked Jack, going directly to the point that concerned them most. "They have money, influence, lawyers on 2 continents." Hammond nodded, acknowledging the gravity of the obstacle. "The Duvals are certainly formidable adversaries," he admitted, "but they also have weak points. Their reluctance to use official channels to claim Clara suggests that there are aspects of their family situation they would prefer to keep private." He leaned forward, slightly lowering his voice as if he feared being heard. "The preliminary investigation we've conducted has revealed disturbing rumors about the treatment of Clara in the Duval mansion. If necessary, we could request an official investigation for possible child abuse." Clara tensed. The idea of publicly exposing the details of her life in the Duval mansion, of reliving those years of loneliness and constant humiliations, terrified her. "Would that be absolutely necessary?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hammond looked at her with genuine compassion. "We hope not," he responded. "Our main strategy is to focus on the present, your current well-being, your integration into the community, the emotional stability you found with Mr. McAllister. The past would only be used as a last resort." Jack, who had remained silent, processing all the information, finally spoke. "What are our next steps?" Hammond reorganized the documents, creating what appeared to be a visual action plan. "First, we'll present a formal adoption request, backed by all the documentation we've gathered," he explained. "This will officially establish your intentions and initiate the legal process." He pointed to another document. "In parallel, we'll request a temporary restraining order against the Duvals, based on Clara's testimony about their past behavior and Sheriff Tanner's reports about the recent harassment." Clara and Jack exchanged looks. It was more than they had hoped for, but also the beginning of a battle that could be long and exhausting. "And if they try to take her by force while all this is being resolved?" asked Jack, giving voice to the fear that had accompanied them since Mr. Duval's visit. Hammond frowned, considering the possibility. "Once we present the adoption request, any attempt to take Clara without judicial authorization would be considered kidnapping," he responded. "But I understand your concern. I would suggest maintaining a low profile, being alert to any suspicious activity, and keeping Sheriff Tanner informed about your movements." The meeting continued for another hour, discussing legal details, signing documents, establishing deadlines. When they finally left the office, Clara felt emotionally exhausted, but also for the first time in a long time hopeful. On the way back, as Phoenix was left behind and the landscape gradually became more familiar, Clara broke the silence that had settled between them. "Do you think it will work?" she asked, looking at Jack in profile, noticing the lines of concern that had appeared on his forehead. Jack considered the question before responding, with the honesty that had always characterized their relationship. "I don't know," he finally admitted, "but I know we'll fight with everything we have." Clara nodded, satisfied with that response. It wasn't a promise of victory, but of something perhaps more important. The certainty that, whatever happened, they would face it together. Upon arriving at Dry Creek, Jack stopped the truck in front of the general store. They needed provisions, and Clara had promised to show her new drawings to Miss Jenkins, who would be there for the weekly support committee meeting. The town seemed especially active that afternoon. Groups of neighbors conversed animatedly on the main street, and a festive atmosphere permeated the air. Clara noticed flags and garlands being hung between buildings. "What's happening?" she asked as they descended from the vehicle. Jack seemed as surprised as she was. "I don't know. I don't remember any celebration scheduled for this week." The answer came in the form of Silas, who approached them with a radiant smile, accompanied by Dr. Callahan and several more members of the committee. "There they are!" he exclaimed, patting Jack's shoulder with his usual enthusiasm. "The heroes of the day!" Jack and Clara exchanged confused looks. "What are you talking about, Silas?" asked Jack. It was Dr. Callahan who responded, her usually serious face illuminated by a smile. "The news arrived an hour ago. Vernon Hale has been arrested in Phoenix for tax fraud and bribery of officials. It seems his shady businesses have finally caught up with him." Clara felt Jack tense beside her, processing the information. "And his claims on my lands?" he asked, cautiously hopeful. "Annulled," responded Silas, with evident satisfaction. "The judge has dismissed all pending lawsuits, considering them part of his fraudulent scheme." A murmur of approval ran through the small group that had formed around them. Jack seemed momentarily speechless, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the news. "I don't understand," he finally said. "How?" Dr. Callahan exchanged a complicit look with Silas before responding. "Let's say certain documentation reached the hands of the tax authorities, documentation that proved Vernon has been falsifying his declarations for years." Clara understood then what had happened. The community, tired of Vernon's manipulations, had taken matters into their own hands, using their own methods to protect one of their own. "That means," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "It means the cabin and the lands are indisputably yours, Jack," completed Dr. Callahan. "At least that battlefront is closed." Clara observed how Jack's face transformed, years of worry dissolving in an instant. It was the first tangible victory in their long struggle, a first step toward the security they so longed for. That night, the entire town gathered in the square for an improvised celebration. Long tables covered with homemade food, music, dance, laughter that seemed to vibrate with collective relief. Vernon Hale had been a shadow over Dry Creek for too long, and his fall felt like a liberation for everyone. Clara, seated next to Jack at the edge of the celebration, contemplated the scene with a mixture of joy and amazement. She had never experienced this feeling of community, of belonging to something larger than oneself. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she commented as she watched the children chasing each other between tables, the adults dancing without worrying about appearing dignified, the elderly telling stories of the old days to whoever wanted to listen. Jack nodded, following her gaze. "It's what Amélie always loved about this place," he responded. "Not just the landscape, but the people, the way they take care of each other." Clara thought about the woman in the portrait, about the pages of her diary, about how she had extended her hand across time to bring her here, to offer her this family, this community, this possibility of belonging. "I would have liked to know her," she said softly. Jack looked at her with a smile tinged with melancholy. "She would have adored you," he responded with certainty. "Somehow, I think she always knew you would come." Miss Jenkins approached then, with a folder in her hands and an expression of barely contained enthusiasm. "Clara, I need to show you something," she said, sitting next to them. "I just received the response from the Phoenix Academy of Arts." Clara held her breath. Weeks ago, Miss Jenkins had sent some of her drawings to a special program for young talents, insisting that she had a gift that deserved to be professionally developed. "They've accepted you," announced the teacher, extracting a letter from the folder, "with a full scholarship for Saturday classes." Jack and Clara read the letter together, their heads bent over the paper, their expressions passing from disbelief to joy. "This is incredible," murmured Clara, feeling that words were insufficient. "It's deserved," responded Miss Jenkins firmly. "You have extraordinary talent, Clara, and now you'll have the opportunity to fully develop it." Jack put an arm around Clara's shoulders, drawing her into a half-embrace that communicated more than any word. Pride, joy, the silent promise that he would do whatever necessary so she could follow this path. The music changed to a slow and nostalgic melody. Couples began to dance under the stars, their silhouettes moving softly in the half-light illuminated by lanterns. "Go," said Clara, slightly pushing. "Jack, Dr. Callahan has been looking over here all night." Jack seemed momentarily disconcerted, then embarrassed, finally resolute. He stood up, smoothing his shirt with a nervous gesture that Clara had never seen in him. "Will you be okay?" he asked, with that constant concern that now formed an essential part of their relationship. Clara smiled, pointing to Miss Jenkins, who was already moving away to join another group. "I won't be alone," she responded. "Go." As she watched Jack cross the square toward Dr. Callahan, inviting her to dance with an almost comical formality, Clara felt a warmth expanding in her chest. She recognized the sensation, although it was so new to her that it still had no name. It was the peace of knowing herself exactly where she should be, of seeing how the pieces of her life were finally beginning to fit together. The medallion against her skin seemed to resonate with that sensation, as if the woman who had worn it before her silently approved of this moment, this evolution, this rebirth. And as the night progressed and the town celebrated not only Vernon's fall, but also, without knowing it, the beginning of a new stage in Clara's life, she mentally drew the scene, capturing this instant of collective happiness as a treasure she could revisit in the difficult moments that, without doubt, still awaited in the future. Because the Duvals were still out there, and the legal battle was just beginning. But tonight, under the starry sky of Arizona, surrounded by people who had accepted her as one of their own, Clara allowed herself to simply be, not an heiress in dispute, not an adopted orphan, not a shameful secret, but simply Clara. And for the first time in her life, that seemed more than enough. Summer deployed its golden mantle over Dry Creek, turning the fields into undulating oceans of mature wheat and the distant mountains into trembling mirages under the relentless sun. In the cabin, now unrecognizable after months of renovations, preparations for the final hearing of the adoption process were in full swing. Clara, standing before the mirror in her room, contemplated her reflection with a mixture of nervousness and determination. The blue dress, adjusted so many times during the last year, rested on the bed, substituted today by a more formal outfit: pleated skirt, impeccable white blouse, Amelie's medallion as the only visible adornment. Her hair, longer now, had been gathered in an elaborate braid, the work of Dr. Callahan, who insisted that presentation was crucial to impress the judge. "You look perfect," said Jack from the door, his voice betraying the tension both felt. Clara turned to look at him. He too had transformed for the occasion: dark suit that Mrs. Henderson had meticulously adjusted, tie that Clara had helped him knot that morning, freshly cut hair. He seemed younger, and at the same time, more solemn. "You too," she responded, with a smile that tried to be reassuring. 6 months had passed. Since their visit to Hammond's office, 6 months of endless documents, testimonies, psychological evaluations, visits from social workers. 6 months in which the Duvals had deployed their entire legal arsenal, sending lawyers from France, presenting claims based on legal kinships, even attempting to question Jack's mental stability based on his period of isolation after Amelie's disappearance. But they had also been 6 months of small but significant victories: the restraining order granted against the Duval representatives, the favorable report from the social worker, the letters of support arriving not only from Dry Creek, but from neighboring communities that had heard their story, and, perhaps most importantly, 6 months in which the relationship between Clara and Jack had evolved from an alliance born of necessity to a genuine and deep family bond. They were no longer two castaways clinging to each other to survive. They were family, in all the senses that mattered. "Nervous?" asked Jack as they headed to the truck where Dr. Callahan and Silas were already waiting for them. Clara considered the question, seeking the most honest answer. "More like expectant," she finally responded. "Whatever happens today, I know we've done everything possible." Jack nodded, recognizing the maturity in her words. During the last year, Clara had blossomed not only in stature, but in wisdom, in confidence, in the ability to face adversity with a strength that many adults would envy. The trip to Phoenix transpired in a silence charged with contained emotions. Dr. Callahan reviewed her notes for the testimony, while Silas occasionally attempted to lighten the atmosphere with anecdotes from his youth. Clara observed the familiar landscape, each curve of the road, each rock formation, wondering if this would be the last time she would see it, because, despite her apparent calm, she knew there was a possibility that the judge would rule in favor of the Duvals, that they would force her to return to France, to that life that now seemed to belong to another person. The Phoenix courthouse was an imposing building of light stone, with columns that seemed to support the weight of all the transcendental decisions made under its roof. On the entrance steps, Hammond awaited them, his expression professionally neutral but with a gleam in his eyes that suggested confidence. "Everything is prepared," he informed, as he guided them through marble hallways toward the assigned room. "Judge Wilson has a reputation for being fair and particularly sensitive in cases involving the welfare of minors." Clara nodded, storing that information as a small ray of hope. At her side, Jack walked erect, his hand occasionally brushing hers in a gesture of silent support. The courtroom was already half full when they entered. On the opposite side, a group of men in impeccable suits surrounded a figure that Clara immediately recognized. Her uncle, as rigid and cold as she remembered. Him, his gaze fixed on her as if evaluating merchandise at auction. Clara kept her head high, refusing to be intimidated. This was not the court she had feared in her nightmares. It was an ordered, civilized space where laws and justice, not the power of money, would have the last word, or at least she hoped so. The hearing began with the formalities of protocol. Judge Wilson, an elderly man with penetrating eyes under bushy eyebrows, listened to the initial arguments from both parties with impassive attention. The Duval lawyer, a Parisian with fluid words and elegant gestures, presented his case with surgical precision. Clara was a Duval by blood. Her place was with her biological family. Her education and future would be better ensured under their guardianship. Hammond responded with equal eloquence but greater passion, emphasizing not the blood ties but the emotional bonds forged during the last year, Clara's evident well-being under Jack's care, her integration into the Dry Creek community. Then came the testimonies. Dr. Callahan spoke with professional authority about Clara's physical and emotional development. Continuing from the court hearing chapter, Dr. Callahan spoke with professional authority about Clara's physical and emotional development, about Jack's transformation from devastating loneliness to responsible parenthood. Silas contributed the community's perspective, describing how both had become essential parts of the social fabric of Dry Creek. Clara listened to everything attentively, aware that not only her immediate future was being decided, but the entire course of her life. When it was finally her turn to speak, she rose with a calmness that surprised even Hammond. She walked to the stand with measured steps, aware of all eyes fixed on her. She took the oath with a clear voice, looking directly at the judge as she did so. "Clara," Hammond began, deliberately using the name she had chosen, "could you tell the court how you came to live with Mr. McAllister?" Clara breathed deeply before responding. "I escaped from the Duval mansion in France after years of being treated as a shameful secret," she said, her voice gaining firmness with each word. "My mother was a servant who had a relationship with Etienne Duval. When I was born, instead of acknowledging me, they kept me hidden, raised among servants, but without being completely one of them." She paused, organizing her memories. "When the elder Duval died, my uncle decided to send me to a boarding school in Switzerland, a place where they sent problematic girls to be corrected. So I fled, and I found my way to Jack's cabin thanks to the coordinates that Amélie McAllister had left in her diary." Hammond nodded, encouraging her to continue. "And how has your life been with Mr. McAllister?" Clara briefly looked toward Jack before responding, finding in his eyes the strength she needed. "At first, we were both lost," she responded with honesty. "Me, fleeing from a painful past, him trapped in a grief that seemed endless, but little by little we found each other. He taught me to ride, to repair fences, to read the sky, to predict the weather. I taught him to make French bread, to enjoy dawns again, to not fear the future." Her voice broke slightly, but she recovered with determination. "Jack McAllister has given me what the Duvals never offered me, despite all their resources. A home. Not just a roof and food, but a place where I am valued for who I am, not judged by the circumstances of my birth." The silence in the room was absolute. Clara could feel the weight of each word, the simple but powerful truth they conveyed. "If the court decided to send you back to the Duvals," asked Hammond, his voice gentle but firm, "how would you feel?" Clara didn't hesitate. "I would feel as if I were being torn not only from my home, but from myself," she responded. "The Duvals can offer me education, social position, even wealth. But Jack has given me something much more valuable, the possibility of being simply Clara, without shame, without fear, without secrets." Hammond nodded, satisfied with her response. "One last question, Clara. What do you expect from the future if the court allows you to continue living with Mr. McAllister?" Clara smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated her face from within. "I hope to keep learning. At school, in the art classes in Phoenix, but also from Jack, from Dr. Callahan, from all of Dry Creek. I hope to continue drawing, perhaps someday illustrate books like the ones Amélie used to read. I hope to see Jack teach other children to ride, as he now does on weekends. I hope—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I hope to continue building this life we've begun together. Because it feels right, it feels true, it feels like the place I belong." When she finished her testimony, Clara returned to her seat, aware of the unshed tears in Jack's eyes, of Dr. Callahan's proud smile, of her uncle's impassive but slightly less cold expression. The Duval lawyer subjected her to a rigorous cross-examination, trying to find cracks in her testimony, suggesting she had been manipulated, that her age made her incapable of making informed decisions about her future. Clara responded to each question with a composure that belied her 12 years, without letting herself be provoked, without falling into contradictions. Finally, it was Jack's turn. As he walked to the stand, Clara noticed how much he had changed since that first encounter at the cabin door. He was no longer the man broken by pain, consumed by loss. He had regained not only his strength, but also his humanity, his capacity to connect, to love again. Hammond guided him through his testimony skillfully, allowing him to explain how Clara's arrival had transformed not only his personal life, but also his relationship with the community, how together they had begun to rebuild what tragedy had destroyed. "Mr. McAllister," Hammond finally asked, "Why do you want to legally adopt Clara?" Jack looked directly at the judge when responding. "Because she's already my daughter in all the ways that matter," he said, with a simplicity that contained all the necessary truth. The paper would just make official what our hearts already know. The hearing continued well into the afternoon. Experts were called by both sides, documents were presented, legal arguments were wielded with increasing complexity. Clara felt that her future was being dissected into clinical parts, stripped of the emotion and humanity that made it real. When Judge Wilson finally announced that he was retiring to deliberate, promising a verdict for the next morning, Clara felt emotionally and physically exhausted. Hammond assured them that everything had gone well, that their testimonies had been convincing, that they had reason to be optimistic, but the uncertainty was still there, heavy and tangible like a physical presence. That night, lodged in a modest hotel near the courthouse, Clara couldn't fall asleep. She got up silently and approached the window, contemplating the lights of Phoenix, so different from the starry darkness of Dry Creek. A soft knock on the door connecting to the adjacent room startled her. "Clara?" Jack's voice, low but clear. "Are you awake?" "Yes," she responded, opening the door. Jack also seemed unable to sleep. They sat together on the small sofa by the window, contemplating the nocturnal city in silence. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Jack finally said, "I want you to know something." Clara looked at him, waiting. "Meeting you has been the greatest gift life could have given me after losing Amélie," he continued, with a voice charged with contained emotion. "You gave me back not only hope, but the capacity to look forward instead of remaining trapped in the past." Clara felt tears accumulating in her eyes. "You saved me first," she responded. "You gave me a home when I needed it most." Jack gently shook his head. "We saved each other," he corrected. "And that, I believe, is what truly forms a family." They remained like that, in shared silence, until the first rays of dawn began to illuminate the horizon. It was a new day, and with it would come the decision that would define their future. The courthouse seemed even more imposing in the clarity of morning. Clara, again dressed with precision, Amelie's medallion over her heart, advanced alongside Jack with a calmness that was only possible because they had found their peace the night before. Whatever happened, what they had built together was real, was valuable, was indestructible in its deepest essence. The room was full, not only the direct participants in the case, but also a considerable delegation from Dry Creek that had traveled that morning to show their support. Clara saw familiar faces in the crowd: Miss Jenkins, Sheriff Tanner, Mrs. Henderson, even some of her school companions accompanied by their parents. When Judge Wilson entered, the entire room stood. Clara noticed that her hands trembled slightly and felt Jack's hand take hers discreetly, transmitting strength. After carefully considering all the testimonies and evidence presented, the judge began, his voice resonating in the silent room. "I have reached a decision in the case of the custody and potential adoption of Clara Beauchamp." He paused, his eyes scanning the room before continuing. "In cases like this, my primary duty is to determine what arrangement will best serve the superior interest of the minor involved. It's not simply about blood ties or legal documents, but about the emotional, physical, and psychological well-being of the child." Clara held her breath, her hand gripping Jack's as if it were her anchor in a storm. "The Duval family has presented convincing arguments based on their biological relationship and their resources to provide education and opportunities," the judge continued. "However, Clara's testimony, supported by professional reports and the evident support of an entire community, paints a clear picture of where her true home is." Judge Wilson looked directly at Clara before pronouncing his verdict. "Therefore, I rule in favor of Mr. John Jack McAllister, granting full and permanent custody of Clara Beauchamp, with the recommendation that the formal adoption process proceed as soon as possible." The room erupted in applause and exclamations of joy. Clara found herself wrapped in an embrace, so tight it almost cut off her breath, as Jack lifted her from the floor in a burst of pure joy. Around them, the neighbors from Dry Creek celebrated as if they had won a war, embracing each other, some even crying openly. Only when Jack set her back on the ground could Clara see her uncle's reaction. She expected to see fury, perhaps contempt or indignation. Instead, what she saw surprised her, an expression of calm resignation, almost of relief, as if deep down, he too knew this was the right outcome. Their gazes crossed briefly across the room. Clara slightly inclined her head, not in submission but in acknowledgement of their shared past, of the blood ties that would always exist, of a complicated family history that didn't define her future but couldn't be completely erased either. Her uncle responded with a similar gesture, barely perceptible, before turning and leaving the room, followed by his entourage of lawyers. Hammond approached, radiant, to congratulate them. "There's still paperwork, of course," he said. "The formal adoption will take a few months, but the main thing is done. Clara is officially part of the McAllister family." The journey back to Dry Creek was completely different from the outward one. The tense silence had been replaced by animated conversations, plans for the future, even occasional songs led by Silas, whose surprisingly melodious voice revealed a hidden talent. Upon arriving in town, they were received as heroes. An improvised celebration in the central square, shared food, music, dancing under the stars. Clara observed everything with a sense of wonderful unreality, as if she were living inside one of her own drawings. Later that night, when the celebration began to die down, and most of the neighbors had retired to their homes, Clara and Jack walked together back to the cabin. The night sky of Arizona displayed its magnificence above them, a mantle of stars so bright they could almost be touched. "You know," said Clara, breaking the contemplative silence, "I think I now understand why Amélie loved this place so much." Jack looked at her curiously. "Why?" Clara pointed toward the starry sky, then toward the lights of the town in the distance, finally toward the silhouette of the cabin that was outlined against the horizon. "Because here things are real," she responded. "There are no pretensions, no masks, just people living the best they can, helping each other, finding beauty in simplicity." Jack nodded, understanding. "Amélie used to say that real life happens in the spaces between the big decisions," he commented. "In shared breakfasts, in sunsets contemplated together, in the small daily victories." Upon reaching the cabin, Clara stopped a moment to observe it with new eyes. It was no longer the ramshackle structure she had found that first day, but a home in the full sense of the word, cared for, loved, inhabited by memories and hopes. Jack opened the door, turned on the lights, and a familiar aroma greeted them: wood, coffee, the remains of the bread they had baked together before departing for Phoenix. It smelled like home, like security, like belonging. Clara headed to her room, but stopped halfway, turning toward Jack, who was watching her from the living room. "There's something I've wanted to ask you," she said, gathering courage. Can I call you Dad now?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Jack looked at her with an expression that contained so many emotions that Clara couldn't identify them all. Surprise, joy, humility, gratitude, love in its purest form. "Nothing would make me happier," he finally responded, his voice hoarse with emotion. That night, lying in her bed, Clara took out the medallion she had worn all day. She opened it, observing Jack's image on one side and the empty space on the other. Tomorrow, she decided, she would put a photograph there, not to replace Amélie, whose spirit would always be part of this story, but to complete the circle that had begun long before she arrived at this cabin, at this town, at this life. She closed her eyes, feeling the comforting weight of the medallion against her palm, a legacy, a promise, a tangible symbol of second chances. For Jack, who had found the strength to love again. For her, who had discovered what it truly meant to belong. For both of them, who had built something new and beautiful from the fragments of broken lives. Outside, the desert wind whispered among the boards of the renovated cabin like an ancient lullaby, and Clara slipped into sleep with the tranquil certainty of one who has finally found her place in the world, of one who knows without a doubt that she is exactly where she belongs,